Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we're going to drift back into the Middle Ages. So go ahead, dim the lights, fluff the pillows, maybe grab that extra blanket you secretly stole from the guest bed, because we're not rushing anywhere. We're about to float lazily into the world of medieval royalty. A place where crowns were heavy, family trees were more like tangled hedges, and everyone seemed to die of either a fever or a bad marriage. This is not a tale of heroic knights and shining princesses. It's the slow-motion parade of royals who coughed, sulked, schemed, and occasionally married their cousins way too many times. So, let's start drifting. The royal brand. Born weird, stay weird. Medieval kings and queens loved to present themselves as chosen by God. It sounded impressive, but honestly, being chosen usually meant being chosen to marry your 12-year-old cousin or being forced to sit on a cold throne while nobles shouted about taxes. Royal life was weirdly glamorous and miserable at the same time. Think of it like eating cake every day, except the cake is half rotten and everyone is watching you chew. Children born into these families rarely had a normal moment. From the cradle, they were political pawns. Babies weren't just babies, they were bargaining chips. A 1-year-old prince could already be betrothed to a 4-year-old princess across the continent. Romantic, right? Nothing says love like not being able to walk yet, but already being married on paper. And of course, inbreeding was the royal family hobby. They treated genetic diversity like it was an optional feature. Kind of like heated seats in a car. Unnecessary. Why risk new DNA when you can recycle the same pool forever? The half-baked Habsburg potato. Let's float first to the Habsburgs, because they basically turned inbreeding into an art form. Everyone knows Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. He wasn't bewitched. He was just a victim of about 200 years of cousin marriages. Charles was supposed to be the shining symbol of Habsburg power. Instead, he looked like someone had tried to sculpt a royal face out of soft clay and forgot to finish. The infamous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced on him that eating was basically full contact sport. And speaking? Well, let's just say royal decrees sound less intimidating when your tongue can't quite keep up with your teeth. He couldn't walk until he was 8. He didn't talk until he was 4. And by the time he became king, he was so physically weak and mentally fragile that courtiers described him as more of a shadow than a man, which is not exactly the vibe you want from your divine ruler. But of course, he was married. Twice. Because naturally, even a half-baked potato needed a political bride. Neither marriage produced children, because frankly, his body had given up on continuing the dynasty. By the time he died in 1700, Spain was exhausted, his dynasty collapsed, and the War of Spanish Succession exploded across Europe. All thanks to centuries of family trees that looked like badly drawn circles. Royal childhoods. Small thrones, big problems. But it wasn't just genetics making royal life weird. childhood itself was a bizarre royal experience. If you were born into a royal crib, congratulations, you would immediately be handed to a wet nurse. Your parents, they wouldn't really raise you. That was for commoners. Kings and queens didn't change diapers. That's what servants were for. But that didn't mean your life was carefree. Royal kids were basically raised inside political pressure cookers. Every bite of porridge, every sneeze, every tantrum, someone wrote it down in a court record. Imagine being 6 years old, throwing a fit because you didn't want to eat turnips, and then having that officially noted for posterity. Prince Geoffrey cried today. The turnips remain uneaten. Congratulations, you've made history. And yet, despite all the medical drama, these children were dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing. Tiny crowns, tiny robes. Picture a 3-year-old toddling around in fur-lined velvet trying not to trip on his own train. Adorable? Maybe. Practical? Absolutely not. Let's glide over to England, because English royal kids were a whole different breed of spoiled. Take Richard II. Born in 1367, he was king by the age of 10, which already sounds like a bad idea. Imagine handing an entire kingdom to a kid who probably still thought dragons were real. Richard was spoiled rotten by his courtiers. He grew up believing he was semi-divine, basically untouchable. He loved fine clothes, extravagant feasts, and being praised constantly. He also had a bad temper, which is not the best trait for a medieval king holding absolute power. When peasants revolted in 1381, Richard, still a teenager, rode out to meet them. And to his credit, he actually handled it pretty well, calming the crowd. But later, he grew paranoid, cruel, and obsessed with punishing anyone who crossed him. By adulthood, he was less boy king and more petulant tyrant. Eventually, his cousin Henry IV deposed him. Richard was imprisoned, starved, and died. A royal childhood of pampering had turned into a tragic, lonely end. So yes, being spoiled as a royal child wasn't exactly the winning lottery ticket it seemed. Quirky habits of medieval royals. Royal weirdness didn't stop at childhood or genetics. Their daily habits were equally strange. For instance, medieval monarchs often believed in the mystical healing power of their own touch. In England and France, kings practiced the royal touch, laying hands on sick people, supposedly curing them of scrofula, also called the king's evil. Imagine being desperately ill, traveling miles to see the king, and he just pecked your head like a golden retriever. Magically healed? No, but at least you got a story out of it. Royal dining was also peculiar. Meals were massive spectacles. Picture halls filled with roasted swans, peacocks served with their feathers reattached, and pies stuffed with live birds that would fly out when cut. Basically, medieval royals invented dinner theater, but with more food poisoning. And while the nobles feasted, hygiene was questionable. Toothbrushes weren't exactly standard. Bathing was infrequent. Some kings believed too much bathing weakened the body. So yes, the guy in the jewel-encrusted crown probably smelled like he'd just wrestled a goat. Let's drift into their bedtime. Because bedtime was no less strange. Beds were massive, with heavy curtains to keep out drafts. Sometimes multiple people slept in one bed. Servants, guards, even courtiers. Privacy was rare. Imagine being the King of France rolling over and realizing your chamberlain is right there, also tucking in. Romantic, right? Nothing sets the mood like 50 political advisors watching you awkwardly climb under the sheets. Let's leave it here for tonight. We've only skimmed the surface of the bizarre world of medieval royalty. Genetic disaster.
Part 4. The Weird Life of Royalty in Medieval Times. Welcome back, dreamers. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've now endured more royal misery than most courtiers, who usually quit after one winter of drafty castles and endless ceremonies. So, sink deeper into the quiet. Tonight, we'll drift eastward and a little south to explore more corners of medieval royalty. Because weirdness wasn't just an English or French specialty. From Byzantine emperors to Eastern rulers, dynastic oddities spread across the map like spilled wine at a royal feast. The Byzantines. Purple or nothing. Let's start with Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were obsessed with ceremony. Every detail of court life was choreographed. Even sneezing near the emperor was probably recorded in a dusty book somewhere. One of the strangest traditions was the idea of being born in the purple. This meant being born in a special chamber lined with purple stone, reserved for reigning emperors' children. If you weren't born in the purple, your legitimacy was always questioned. Imagine being a prince, raised in luxury, only to have nobles whisper, "Well, yes, but were you born in the purple room?" Apparently, your entire career could collapse because your mother gave birth in the wrong chamber. And emperors themselves? They weren't exactly stable. Take Justin II, who succeeded his uncle Justinian. He apparently suffered a mental breakdown, often biting his attendants and screaming uncontrollably. Not great for diplomacy. His wife eventually had to step in, quietly taking power while Justin spent his days being rolled around the palace on a wheeled throne, like some sort of angry toddler in permanent timeout. The pale, sickly sons of Eastern Europe. Royal weakness wasn't just a Western thing. In Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, dynasties were plagued with fragile heirs. Take Ladislaus the Posthumous of Hungary. Born after his father died, he entered the world already carrying a crown he couldn't lift. He grew up under the control of powerful regents who basically treated him like a pawn on a chessboard. He finally reached adulthood, was betrothed, and then, predictably, died young, probably poisoned. So much for royal destiny. It seems half the crowns in Eastern Europe ended up on the heads of children who barely lived long enough to keep them from slipping down to their noses. The curious case of Empress Irene. Back to Byzantium for a moment, because Empress Irene deserves a bedtime mention. She was the mother of Constantine VI, who technically should have been the emperor, but Irene had other plans. She took over as regent, then eventually had her son's eyes gouged out so she could rule alone. Not exactly a hallmark mother-son story. But it worked. Sort of. She reigned in her own name, something almost unheard of for a Byzantine woman. Of course, it didn't end well. She was eventually deposed, exiled, and died in relative obscurity. Because in Byzantium, even the most brutal family decisions rarely guaranteed long-term success. Royal fashion, velvet, and stench. Now, let's drift from palaces and politics to something lighter, fashion. Royal clothing was elaborate, heavy, and mostly uncomfortable. Kings and queens wore layer upon layer of silk, velvet, fur, and jewels. Looking majestic meant sweating profusely, especially in summer when a crown doubled as a very shiny sauna. Perfume helped cover the stench, since regular bathing wasn't exactly a priority. Imagine entering a hall filled with nobles, all reeking of unwashed wool, garlic breath, and musk. The glittering jewels might distract you briefly, but your nose would never forget. And shoes. Pointy shoes became so long and ridiculous that nobles sometimes had to tie the tips to their knees to walk. So yes, your medieval king might have strutted into court looking like an overdressed elf. Weird parenting rules. Royal children had odd upbringings everywhere, but Byzantium added its own flavor. Some emperors sent their sons to monasteries to train in discipline, which basically meant shaving their heads and leaving them in cold stone rooms to chant psalms. Great preparation for ruling an empire. Other times, potential rivals, including brothers and cousins, were deliberately blinded or castrated so they couldn't claim the throne. Yes, medieval succession planning often meant ruining your relatives before they ruined you. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner with that family. The Caliphs of Cordoba, luxury overload. While European royals struggled in drafty castles, Islamic rulers in Al-Andalus lived in dazzling luxury. The Caliphs of Cordoba had palaces with running water, gardens, fountains, and libraries that made European courts look like barns. Al-Hakam II, for example, was a book lover who collected hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Meanwhile, most European kings were still struggling to read their own names. But even here, weirdness crept in. His successor, Hisham II, was manipulated by ambitious nobles and generals until he became little more than a puppet. The contrast between palatial splendor and personal powerlessness was stark. You might sit on a golden throne, but still not be in control of your own empire. Let's glide to the Holy Roman Empire. Endless elections. Now, over to the Holy Roman Empire, a political mess wrapped in an imperial title. Unlike most monarchies, the emperor wasn't strictly hereditary. He was elected by a group of powerful princes. So the supposed Roman emperor was really just a German noble with good connections and a lot of bribes. Election campaigns were filled with gifts, promises, and backroom deals. So the empire that claimed to be the heir of Rome was really run like a medieval popularity contest. And yet, emperors still acted as though they were universal rulers. They staged grand ceremonies, issued decrees, and insisted on elaborate etiquette. It was all theater, with very little actual power, which, honestly, is the most medieval royal thing of all. The heirs who weren't ready. Another theme that keeps floating up is how many heirs just weren't prepared for rule. Take Wenceslas of Bohemia, not the Christmas Carol one, a later king. He was supposed to unite his realm, but he preferred drinking and hunting. Nobles grew so frustrated they kidnapped him. Eventually, he was deposed and spent the rest of his life as a royal nobody. Or John I of France, nicknamed the Posthumous. He lived for 5 days. That's it. 5 days on the throne, which has to be the shortest royal career in history. France immediately plunged into succession crises. Apparently, you can't expect much leadership from a newborn. Sleepy reflections. So, what do we have tonight? Byzantine emperors rolling around on wheeled thrones, claiming purple birth chambers, Hungarian kings who barely lived long enough to be crowned, an empress who blinded her son for power, pointy shoes tied to knees, and royal elections that were just medieval bribe fests. It's strange, isn't it? We imagine royalty as stable, glamorous, commanding, but their actual lives were fragile, absurd, and often sad. A mix of ceremony and chaos, with crowns that weighed more in misery than in gold. So, as your eyelids get heavy, picture it gently. A king in velvet robes, sweating under candlelight. A child emperor staring blankly at monks chanting in cold stone halls. An empress smoothing her crown while quietly planning her son's downfall. Weird. Tragic, and softly funny, because medieval royalty never did know how to just be normal.
Part 3. The Weird Life of Royalty in Medieval Times. Welcome back, night travelers. If you've made it this far, your endurance is now officially greater than most medieval kings, who usually didn't last through dinner without indigestion. So, snuggle in. Tonight, we keep drifting into more of the strange, uncomfortable, and occasionally hilarious details of royal life. We've seen fragile kings, spoiled heirs, and feasts with far too many swans. Now let's float into the world of dynastic disasters, family feuds, and some of the worst marriage choices ever written into law. The Tudors enter the stage. Technically, the Tudors were late medieval, early modern, but honestly, they carried the same weird royal energy, just with slightly better costumes. Take Henry VII, the founder. He won the crown by beating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Richard, by the way, was the guy Shakespeare later described as a deformed villain who killed his nephews in the Tower, which might not be entirely true, but it certainly made good theater. Henry VII wasn't glamorous. He was cautious, quiet, and obsessed with money. In portraits, he looks like he's calculating how many extra taxes he can squeeze from wool exports. But his marriage to Elizabeth of York was a classic royal deal, ending a bloody civil war and uniting the rival houses of Lancaster and York. Did they love each other? Maybe. Did they produce heirs? Yes, several. And that, more than affection, was what really mattered. But the real Tudor weirdness, of course, came with their son, Henry VIII. Too many wives, too much food. Henry VIII is famous for two things: beheading wives and gaining weight. Both true, both tragic, both oddly comedic from a distance. In his youth, Henry was tall, athletic, handsome. People described him like some medieval golden boy. Then he discovered feasting, jousting injuries, and the joy of absolute power. By middle age, he was so obese that he had to be lifted onto his horse with a crane. Imagine being King of England and basically requiring construction equipment to attend tournaments. His marital record is legendary. 6 wives, 2 executed, 2 divorced, 1 died, 1 outlived him. Not exactly the happy ever after you'd expect from royal unions, but the funniest part is why it all happened. Henry desperately wanted a son. He thought God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. So he ditched her, married Anne Boleyn, then executed Anne when she failed to produce a surviving male heir. Classic, it's not me, it's you energy, but with heads rolling. And here's the kicker. The daughter he had with Anne, Elizabeth I, went on to become one of England's greatest monarchs. The son he obsessed over, Edward VI, died at 15.
So all the beheadings and divorces ended up pointless. History loves irony, and Henry provided it in abundance. The sad heirs of France. Meanwhile, back in France, royal children continued their tradition of tragic lives. The Dauphin, Louis, son of Charles VII, grew up hating his father. So much so that he basically ran away from home and set up his own little rebellious court. Family dinners must have been awkward. When his father died, Louis XI became king. Nicknamed the Spider King, he spun webs of intrigue, constantly scheming against nobles, allies, and sometimes even his own family. He wasn't glamorous, but he was effective, though not exactly loved. But still, Louis XI shows us another royal truth. Growing up in a poisonous palace often produced adults who trusted no one, smiled rarely, and saw betrayal in every shadow, which is not exactly the recipe for a chill, happy life. The Habsburgs continued. Genetics gone wrong. We already drifted past Charles II of Spain in Part 1, the half-baked Habsburg potato, but the whole dynasty deserves another look. The Habsburg motto might as well have been, "Why marry strangers when you can marry your niece?" Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy. Their descendants married into Spain. Then those descendants married each other. And so on, until eventually the family tree was less tree and more snake eating its own tail. By the 17th century, Habsburg rulers were riddled with health problems. Oversized jaws, drooling, infertility, epilepsy, and mental decline were all common. Doctors back then didn't understand genetics, but they definitely noticed the royal family kept turning out strange. And yet they kept marrying close kin. Why? Because dynastic unity was more important than basic biology. Apparently, keeping Spain and Austria under one dynasty mattered more than whether the next king could chew. Let's glide north. Scandinavian oddities. Royal weirdness wasn't limited to Western Europe. Scandinavia had its share of strange monarchs too. Take Eric of Pomerania, King of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway in the early 1400s. Sounds impressive, 3 crowns at once, but he lost all 3. Why? Because he annoyed literally everyone. He raised taxes, fought unnecessary wars, and was accused of piracy. Yes, the King of Denmark supposedly turned to piracy after being deposed. Imagine being robbed at sea, then realizing your mugger is technically still wearing a crown. Then there was Christian II of Denmark, nicknamed the Tyrant. He ordered a massacre in Stockholm, which didn't win him any popularity contests. Later, he was overthrown, imprisoned, and spent decades locked in a castle until he died. So much for divine right. Scandinavian royals prove that even far from the Habsburgs and Tudors, monarchies could still collapse under the weight of bad decisions and bad temperaments. Medicine, or something like it. Since royals were constantly sick, let's drift briefly into their medical treatments. Doctors back then loved humor theory. The body was thought to be ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, you got sick. The cure was balance them out. This meant bloodletting, purges, and vomit-inducing herbs. Basically, if you weren't sick before, the cure would get you there. Royals often had personal physicians, but being a royal doctor was a thankless job. If the king recovered, it was a miracle. If the king died, it was your fault. Some doctors ended up executed or exiled because their patient didn't survive the plague. So imagine lying in your massive curtain-draped bed, feverish, while a medieval doctor cheerfully brings out the leeches. Royal luxury, indeed. The lonely crown. Beneath all the jewels and ceremonies, many royals were profoundly lonely. A king or queen couldn't choose their friends easily. Everyone around them wanted something: power, wealth, favors. Trust was rare. Children were married off before puberty. Spouses were often strangers, or worse, close relatives. Parents died young, siblings betrayed each other, and courtiers whispered constantly. No wonder so many monarchs turned to religion, superstition, or just plain eccentric habits. When your life is an endless parade of ceremonies and betrayals, believing you're made of glass doesn't sound so crazy anymore. A sleepy pause. So, where are we now? We've floated past England's beheading king, France's fragile heirs, the endlessly inbred Habsburgs, and even a pirate king of Denmark. We've peeked at their feasts, their medicine, and their endless loneliness. And what do we find? That royalty in medieval times wasn't a dream life. It was heavy crowns, bad genetics, strange diets, and marriages that felt more like prison sentences. So as you let your eyes close tonight, picture it softly. A giant banquet hall echoing with the sound of coughing nobles. A king being lifted by a crane onto his horse. A physician earnestly explaining that your headache comes from too much phlegm. Royal luxury, indeed.
Part 4. The Weird Life of Royalty in Medieval Times. Welcome back, dreamers. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've now endured more royal misery than most courtiers, who usually quit after one winter of drafty castles and endless ceremonies. So, sink deeper into the quiet. Tonight, we'll drift eastward and a little south to explore more corners of medieval royalty. Because weirdness wasn't just an English or French specialty. From Byzantine emperors to Eastern rulers, dynastic oddities spread across the map like spilled wine at a royal feast. The Byzantines. Purple or nothing. Let's start with Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were obsessed with ceremony. Every detail of court life was choreographed. Even sneezing near the emperor was probably recorded in a dusty book somewhere. One of the strangest traditions was the idea of being born in the purple. This meant being born in a special chamber lined with purple stone, reserved for reigning emperors' children. If you weren't born in the purple, your legitimacy was always questioned. Imagine being a prince, raised in luxury, only to have nobles whisper, "Well, yes, but were you born in the purple room?" Apparently, your entire career could collapse because your mother gave birth in the wrong chamber. And emperors themselves? They weren't exactly stable. Take Justin II, who succeeded his uncle Justinian. He apparently suffered a mental breakdown, often biting his attendants and screaming uncontrollably. Not great for diplomacy. His wife eventually had to step in, quietly taking power while Justin spent his days being rolled around the palace on a wheeled throne, like some sort of angry toddler in permanent timeout. The pale, sickly sons of Eastern Europe. Royal weakness wasn't just a Western thing. In Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, dynasties were plagued with fragile heirs. Take Ladislaus the Posthumous of Hungary. Born after his father died, he entered the world already carrying a crown he couldn't lift. He grew up under the control of powerful regents who basically treated him like a pawn on a chessboard. He finally reached adulthood, was betrothed, and then, predictably, died young, probably poisoned. So much for royal destiny. It seems half the crowns in Eastern Europe ended up on the heads of children who barely lived long enough to keep them from slipping down to their noses. The curious case of Empress Irene. Back to Byzantium for a moment, because Empress Irene deserves a bedtime mention.
She was the mother of Constantine VI, who technically should have been the emperor. But Irene had other plans. She took over as regent, then eventually had her son's eyes gouged out so she could rule alone. Not exactly a hallmark mother-son story. But it worked. Sort of. She reigned in her own name, something almost unheard of for a Byzantine woman. Of course, it didn't end well. She was eventually deposed, exiled, and died in relative obscurity. Because in Byzantium, even the most brutal family decisions rarely guaranteed long-term success. Royal fashion, velvet, and stench. Now, let's drift from palaces and politics to something lighter, fashion. Royal clothing was elaborate, heavy, and mostly uncomfortable. Kings and queens wore layer upon layer of silk, velvet, fur, and jewels. Looking majestic meant sweating profusely, especially in summer when a crown doubled as a very shiny sauna. Perfume helped cover the stench, since regular bathing wasn't exactly a priority. Imagine entering a hall filled with nobles, all reeking of unwashed wool, garlic breath, and musk. The glittering jewels might distract you briefly, but your nose would never forget. And shoes. Pointy shoes became so long and ridiculous that nobles sometimes had to tie the tips to their knees to walk. So yes, your medieval king might have strutted into court looking like an overdressed elf. Weird parenting rules. Royal children had odd upbringings everywhere, but Byzantium added its own flavor. Some emperors sent their sons to monasteries to train in discipline, which basically meant shaving their heads and leaving them in cold stone rooms to chant psalms. Great preparation for ruling an empire. Other times, potential rivals, including brothers and cousins, were deliberately blinded or castrated so they couldn't claim the throne. Yes, medieval succession planning often meant ruining your relatives before they ruined you. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner with that family. The Caliphs of Cordoba, luxury overload. While European royals struggled in drafty castles, Islamic rulers in Al-Andalus lived in dazzling luxury. The Caliphs of Cordoba had palaces with running water, gardens, fountains, and libraries that made European courts look like barns. Al-Hakam II, for example, was a book lover who collected hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Meanwhile, most European kings were still struggling to read their own names. But even here, weirdness crept in. His successor, Hisham II, was manipulated by ambitious nobles and generals until he became little more than a puppet. The contrast between palatial splendor and personal powerlessness was stark. You might sit on a golden throne, but still not be in control of your own empire. Let's glide to the Holy Roman Empire. Endless elections. Now, over to the Holy Roman Empire, a political mess wrapped in an imperial title. Unlike most monarchies, the emperor wasn't strictly hereditary. He was elected by a group of powerful princes. So the supposed Roman emperor was really just a German noble with good connections and a lot of bribes. Election campaigns were filled with gifts, promises, and backroom deals. So the empire that claimed to be the heir of Rome was really run like a medieval popularity contest. And yet, emperors still acted as though they were universal rulers. They staged grand ceremonies, issued decrees, and insisted on elaborate etiquette. It was all theater, with very little actual power, which, honestly, is the most medieval royal thing of all. The heirs who weren't ready. Another theme that keeps floating up is how many heirs just weren't prepared for rule. Take Wenceslas of Bohemia, not the Christmas Carol one, a later king. He was supposed to unite his realm, but he preferred drinking and hunting. Nobles grew so frustrated they kidnapped him. Eventually, he was deposed and spent the rest of his life as a royal nobody. Or John I of France, nicknamed the Posthumous. He lived for 5 days. That's it. 5 days on the throne, which has to be the shortest royal career in history. France immediately plunged into succession crises. Apparently, you can't expect much leadership from a newborn. Sleepy reflections. So, what do we have tonight? Byzantine emperors rolling around on wheeled thrones, claiming purple birth chambers, Hungarian kings who barely lived long enough to be crowned, an empress who blinded her son for power, pointy shoes tied to knees, and royal elections that were just medieval bribe fests. It's strange, isn't it? We imagine royalty as stable, glamorous, commanding, but their actual lives were fragile, absurd, and often sad. A mix of ceremony and chaos, with crowns that weighed more in misery than in gold. So, as your eyelids get heavy, picture it gently. A king in velvet robes, sweating under candlelight. A child emperor staring blankly at monks chanting in cold stone halls. An empress smoothing her crown while quietly planning her son's downfall. Weird. Tragic, and softly funny, because medieval royalty never did know how to just be normal.
Part 5. When Crowns Met Astrology, Babies, and Strange Rituals. Welcome back, Wanderer. If you're still listening, you've either drifted into half-sleep or you've committed to hearing the entire saga of royal oddities. Either way, tonight's theme takes us into the even stranger corners of royal life, where politics collided with astrology, where babies were crowned before they could sit up, and where coronations themselves became absurd theater. So, take a deep breath. Let the soft darkness wrap around you, and let's explore the rituals that made royalty feel sacred, yet also deeply ridiculous. The stars decide everything. For medieval royalty, astrology wasn't just a hobby, it was serious business. When a royal child was born, astrologers rushed to cast their horoscopes. Kings and queens wanted to know, was this child destined for greatness or destined to fall off a horse at age 14? Edward IV of England reportedly relied heavily on astrologers. So did Catherine de' Medici in France, who kept a whole team of stargazers around her. It wasn't uncommon for coronations, marriages, or even military campaigns to be delayed until the stars looked favorable. Imagine postponing a royal wedding because Mars was in retrograde. Though to be fair, given how disastrous royal marriages often turned out, maybe they should have paid even closer attention to the stars. Astrology also doubled as a political weapon. Predicting a king's downfall through the stars could get you executed, or, if the prophecy came true, remembered as a genius. Coronations, a mix of glory and awkwardness. Royal coronations were supposed to be the pinnacle of majesty, but in practice, they were long, exhausting, and frequently bizarre. Take the English coronation ritual. The monarch was anointed with holy oil, crowned, handed a scepter, orb, sword, and various other shiny objects until their arms must have ached. Then they were expected to walk, kneel, swear oaths, and sit through hours of chanting while wearing 50 pounds of fabric and gold. Oh, and there was always food. Lots of it.
In some coronations, a knight on horseback would literally ride into the hall to declare the monarch's right to rule. Yes, inside the hall. Imagine the smell. And the guests? Half of them probably fell asleep after the third hour. Coronations were meant to look divine, but for most attendees, they were closer to a medieval endurance test. Baby kings and queens. One of the strangest aspects of monarchy was the crowning of infants. Take Henry VI of England. He became king at just 9 months old. 9 months! Too young to walk, talk, or even hold his crown steady. For years he lived as a figurehead, while adults squabbled for power around him. When he finally grew up, he turned out to be timid, indecisive, and plagued by bouts of catatonia. In other words, exactly what you'd expect from a man raised as a baby monarch. Elsewhere, James II of Scotland became king at age 6, while Alfonso XIII of Spain was declared king literally at birth. The crown was placed beside his crib, because nothing says fit to rule than someone who can't yet digest solid food. Of course, these child rulers became puppets for regents and ambitious nobles, which usually meant instability, civil wars, and a lot of wasted potential. The divine right of awkward gestures. Kings weren't just crowned, they were believed to have sacred powers. In France and England, monarchs claimed they could heal diseases just by touching the sick. The royal touch was especially famous for supposedly curing scrofula, a form of tuberculosis. So, after coronations, kings would sometimes spend hours touching hundreds of sick people in long, exhausting ceremonies. Imagine being a monarch, already tired from wearing a gold hat all day, and then being asked to press your hand to the necks of strangers with oozing sores, all while smiling and pretending to be holy. The belief lasted astonishingly long. Even King Charles I of England, right before the Civil War, was still practicing the royal touch. Spoiler alert, it didn't help him from losing his head. Weddings of children. Marriages were another royal ritual that veered into the absurd. Royal children were often married off long before puberty. The wedding might take place when the bride was 6 and the groom was 8, with the understanding that the marriage wouldn't be consummated until later. In the meantime, the two were paraded around as a royal couple. One infamous example. Isabella of Valois was married to Richard II of England at age 6. She was dressed in regal gowns, processed through the streets, and treated as queen while still playing with dolls. These marriages were political tools, with no concern for the actual children involved. And when the children grew up, well, sometimes they hated each other, sometimes one of them died before the marriage could even count, and sometimes it led to entire wars. Royal superstitions. Beyond astrology, monarchs were drowning in superstitions. Henry VIII refused to travel on certain unlucky days. Charles IX of France was so paranoid after St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that he kept special charms to ward off evil spirits. And some kings had lucky relics they carried everywhere, like bits of saints' bones or rings supposedly blessed with holy power. It was less about faith, more about desperation. When you live in a world where your crown is never safe, you start clinging to anything that might keep you alive. When the crown was too heavy. One last sleepy thought. Sometimes crowns themselves caused trouble. They were made of solid gold and jewels, weighing several pounds. During long ceremonies, some kings nearly fainted under the weight. Charles V of France was so frail he often had to hand his crown off to attendants between rituals. At which point, of course, it looked like a game of royal hot potato. Soft reflections. So tonight, what do we see? A world where astrologers decided royal fates? Where coronations were equal part church service and sweaty endurance test? Where babies were dressed as kings and children were forced into political marriages? Where kings claimed to heal the sick with their touch while secretly fearing unlucky days? And where crowns themselves sometimes crushed the very heads they glorified? It's all strangely sad, yet strangely funny, because beneath the layers of velvet, jewels, and ritual, these rulers were fragile humans fumbling in the dark, just like everyone else. So, close your eyes now and imagine it gently. A baby king asleep in his cradle, while adults argue in whispers. A queen child tugging at her heavy gown, wondering when she can go home to her toys. A monarch swaying under a golden crown that weighs more than his kingdom's stability. Drift softly with them into the night. Because in the end, royalty was never about power. It was about performance. Strange, exhausting, and often absurd.
Part 6. Mad monarchs, strange diets, and royal death rituals. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you're deep into the flickering candlelight of history, surrounded by drafty castles, heavy crowns, and a very confused assortment of kings and queens. Tonight, we'll wander into even stranger territory. Mad monarchs, diets that should have killed them sooner, and death rituals so elaborate they almost seem designed to lull you to sleep. So settle in, take a deep breath. Let's drift. Mad monarchs, because sanity was overrated. If there's one thing medieval royalty loved, it was instability. And nothing is more unstable than a mentally fragile monarch. Charles VI of France. Remember him from part 2? The mad king who thought he was made of glass. His fits of madness weren't constant, but when they hit, he would wander the palace hallways at night, sometimes attacking his own guards. He would forget he was king, claim his wife was trying to poison him, and occasionally refuse to eat. Not exactly the image of a wise, divine ruler. Across the Channel, Henry VI of England was similarly ill-equipped for rule. He spent hours staring blankly, catatonic, while nobles ran the kingdom for him. And, as we saw before, he became the tragic center of the Wars of the Roses. Then there was Eric of Pomerania, king of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. He began ruling 3 kingdoms at once, a task too large even for a perfectly sane adult. Predictably, he collapsed under pressure, lost his crowns, and turned to piracy for distraction. Yes, piracy. A king reduced to raiding ships because ruling 3 realms was just too much. The curious case of diet. Feast or famine. Mostly feast. Royal diets were a mix of excessive indulgence and strange traditions. In England, Henry VIII's love of meat and sweets has been mentioned before. His joints swelled from gout, and he required constant care to move around. In France, Charles VI reportedly suffered from digestive issues, exacerbated by enormous feasts of meat, pastries, and wine. But some kings' diets were downright peculiar. Louis XIV of France, slightly later but still in the same vein, enjoyed extremely elaborate meals, including soups so thick with ingredients they resembled stew. Meanwhile, Byzantine emperors often consumed huge amounts of sugar, spices, and honey, sometimes combined with wine.
And let's not forget the caliphs of Cordoba, who were essentially gourmet collectors of food and manuscripts. The result of all this culinary indulgence? A kingdom of kings prone to obesity, gout, and early death. It's almost as if history itself was trying to nudge them toward humility. Royal death rituals. Long, boring, and extremely elaborate. If living as a royal was exhausting, dying was equally ceremonial. Corpses of kings and queens were treated like precious relics. They were washed, clothed in fine garments, and placed on platforms for public viewing. Funerals could last days or weeks with long processions, prayers, and masses. Imagine sitting quietly while the entire court slowly files past a waxy version of your late king. Some royals were even embalmed. The body would be treated with perfumes, spices, and resins to preserve it for as long as possible. This often produced a smell somewhere between roses and decay, an aromatic paradox designed to impress and repel at the same time. One Byzantine emperor was buried in a golden sarcophagus while his relatives fought over the location of his crown. Meanwhile, in France, royal tombs were commissioned with elaborate sculptures, statues of saints and angels holding shields. Death, like life, was a performance. Child monarchs and endless regents. Royal children often didn't live to rule alone. But when they did, it was usually under the watchful eye of a regent. Take Ladislaus the Posthumous in Hungary, mentioned earlier. He spent his early years surrounded by regents, each of whom wanted to control him for power. By the time he was old enough to rule, he was exhausted, paranoid, and perpetually suspicious of everyone. In England, Richard II's cousin, Henry IV, similarly navigated a kingdom where the young king's advisors constantly plotted. Child monarchs didn't get to play. Every action was political. Even sitting at a banquet required awareness of alliances, enemies, and which noble had recently insulted you. The obsessive and odd. Royal weirdness didn't end at crowns and diets. Charles IX of France, for instance, was obsessed with astrology and predictions. He carried charms and relied on horoscopes for decisions. Philip II of Spain consulted priests for everything, from military campaigns to daily meals. And then there was John II of France, captured during the 100 Years' War. He spent years in English captivity, treated both as prisoner and king. He reportedly demanded that English nobles treat him with respect while he was locked in a castle. Because why not insist on courtesy while someone else holds your ransom? Small thrones, big meltdowns. Royal children were miniature adults expected to handle enormous responsibilities. Edward V of England was crowned king at age 12. He spent 2 months in the Tower of London before disappearing mysteriously. Similarly, James II of Scotland became king as a child and spent much of his early life trying to avoid assassination plots. Being a child monarch was stressful. You had no freedom, constant scrutiny, and every decision carried the weight of life and death for your subjects. And yet the adults around you often behaved worse than the children. Life as a performance. If there's one thing to take away from this stretch of history, it's that medieval royal life was performative. Every meal, every bath, every conversation was theater. Kings and queens were always on stage, expected to appear divine, wise, or at least harmlessly charming. Even their mistakes became part of the spectacle. Take Henry VIII again, overweight, gout-ridden, murderous, but charming in portraits. Or Charles VI, glass king by day, madman by night.
Royalty was never about reality. It was about maintaining the illusion that the crown conferred power, wisdom, and majesty, even when it clearly didn't. Soft reflections. So tonight, let's imagine a mad king wandering corridors, convinced he might shatter. A child king staring at a golden crown too large for his head. A queen carefully arranging her charms and charms for protection. A corpse laid out in ceremonial splendor, watched by hundreds of mourners. Royal life was exhausting, strange, and often sad, but somehow, across centuries, it also becomes quietly mesmerizing. Watching them stumble through their obligations, feasts, ceremonies, and rituals is like listening to a soft, endless lullaby of power and absurdity. Sleep now. Let the ghosts of crowns, velvet robes, and pointy shoes drift with you, because medieval royalty, in all their weirdness, are excellent company for a long, quiet night.
Part 7. Inbred dynasties, strange obsessions, and royal pets. Welcome back, gentle night traveler. By now, you're well into the soft glow of history. If you've kept your eyes open this long, congratulations! You're more patient than most royal tutors, who often failed to manage screaming princes and their endless tutors. Tonight, we wander into a mix of genetics, peculiar personal habits, and yes, the odd little creatures that shared royal bedrooms. Because medieval royalty wasn't just about crowns and ceremonies, it was also weirdly domestic. The Habsburg jaw. Genetics gone wild. The Habsburgs deserve special attention. By the 16th century, their obsession with intermarriage had produced a face so distinct, historians call it the Habsburg jaw. Charles II of Spain, the famous half-baked Habsburg potato, suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities due to generations of inbreeding. He could barely chew, drooled constantly, and had difficulty speaking. His health was fragile, and he died without an heir. And yet, the dynasty continued to marry close relatives for centuries. Why? Because keeping power in the family seemed more important than basic biology. Every marriage doubled down on genetic risk. By the late 17th century, the Habsburgs were essentially a cautionary tale, beautiful on paper, tragic in reality. It's almost poetic. Ambition and greed versus simple survival. And while the royals maintained grand titles, their bodies paid the price. Royal obsessions, quirks, and rituals. Medieval kings and queens loved routines, charms, and personal rituals. Charles VI of France had his glass delusion, but he wasn't alone in eccentricity. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, obsessed over his appearance, spending hours each day on clothes, wigs, and bathing rituals. Even walking from one room to another was carefully choreographed, with attendants adjusting his robes and fans following him like a tiny personal wind tunnel. Then there were monarchs obsessed with cleanliness, or the illusion of it. Isabella of Castile reportedly insisted that her chambers be scrubbed daily, and her servants bathed her with perfumed waters. Meanwhile, some kings thought bathing too much would make them weak or ill. Medieval hygiene was full of contradictions, just like royal life itself. Pets in the palace. Yes, medieval royalty had pets. And no, not just the occasional cat or dog. Henry III of England reportedly kept exotic animals, including a bear, which roamed the palace grounds. Catherine de' Medici had a collection of monkeys, while Byzantine emperors occasionally had peacocks roaming their gardens. These pets served multiple purposes. They were entertainment, status symbols, and occasionally tools for diplomacy, because sending a rare animal to a foreign king was a polite way to say, "I am rich," and also slightly terrifying.
But pets also complicated life. Monkeys stole food, bears frightened visitors, and peacocks screamed at all hours. For a royal trying to appear majestic and serene, this could be exhausting. Children, tutors, and endless lessons. Royal children were rarely left alone. They had tutors for reading, writing, languages, religion, and sometimes even fencing or horse riding before they could walk properly. Edward VI of England, for instance, had daily lessons in Latin, Greek, and theology. James II of Scotland reportedly hated his tutors, who imposed rigid schedules on him from sunrise to sunset. And if a child was slow or sickly, the court quickly labeled them weak or incompetent. Childhood illness was a constant threat, and even minor fevers could prevent someone from fulfilling their dynastic destiny. The strangeness of royal entertainment. Royal leisure wasn't what you'd expect. Feasts, hunting, and jousting were standard, but monarchs also indulged in bizarre pastimes. Watching tortures or executions as education, collecting relics and assembling miniature museums of holy bones, practicing royal hunting with exotic animals in palace grounds, commissioning music so complex it would be nearly impossible for humans to perform properly just to show off. Entertainment was rarely relaxing. It was a demonstration of wealth, power, and eccentricity all at once. Religious obsessions. Faith played a huge role in royal lives, often in ways that seem strange today. Charles V of France visited shrines constantly, performing long pilgrimages. Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, spent decades in pious practices, even while leading armies. Kings and queens often believed divine approval was essential for everything, from hunting trips to battles. Religion was both a comfort and a burden. Failing to appear devout could lead to public scandal, or worse, accusations of heresy. So monarchs carefully curated every prayer, procession, and ritual, hoping to maintain the illusion of sacred power. Royal sleep. Harder than you think. Despite palaces filled with luxury, sleep wasn't simple. Chambers were drafty, servants crowded in, and children often woke parents with cries or demands. Kings often slept in ceremonial robes, attended by courtiers in case of emergencies or uprisings. Some monarchs developed insomnia from stress, while others relied on alcohol or opiates to drift off. And of course, beds were extremely heavy and elaborately decorated. Royal sleep was both a performance and a necessity. The line between rest and duty was always blurred. Soft reflections. So, tonight we float through. Habsburg faces twisted by generations of inbreeding. Kings obsessed with clothing, wigs, and ritual cleanliness. Palaces echoing with exotic animals. Children forced into endless lessons and adult responsibilities. Monks, astrologers, and priests guiding every move. Crowns that were heavy, ceremonies that were exhausting, and sleep that was almost impossible. Medieval royalty wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, lonely, and full of absurdity. Yet somehow, watching them stumble through life from the safety of centuries feels gentle, softly funny, quietly tragic, and strangely mesmerizing. Close your eyes. Imagine a monkey stealing your crown while a tutor scolds you. Picture a bear wandering the garden as a courtier sweats under velvet robes. Hear the faint chanting from the chapel as a child king stares at his oversized crown, wishing he could play. That's medieval royalty. And it's perfect for drifting into a long, calm night of sleep.
Part 8. Eccentric Queens, Rivalries, and Palace Intrigue. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you're well acquainted with the absurd, exhausting, and often sad world of medieval royalty. Tonight, we focus on the queens, rivalries, and subtle palace intrigues,
the quiet dramas that shaped kingdoms behind closed doors. So dim the lights, settle deeper into your blanket, and let's drift into the soft, echoing corridors of royal life. The eccentric queens. Not all royal women were passive figures. Some were brilliant. Some were terrifying. Some were just very, very odd. Take Margaret of Anjou, Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses. She was fierce, intelligent, and utterly unwilling to accept that her husband, Henry VI, was too weak to rule effectively. She raised armies, negotiated treaties, and even schemed against rival nobles. In other words, she was a royal manager, general, and political strategist before breakfast. Then there was Catherine de' Medici of France, a queen whose obsession with astrology and omens influenced the entire French court. She reportedly consulted her horoscopes before every major decision, from marriages to battles. Her eccentricity became part of her legend. She was both feared and ridiculed, depending on who was telling the story. And Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of Edward IV, known for her beauty and her skill at court intrigue. She maneuvered herself and her family into positions of power, provoking jealousy and conflict. Her life reminds us that queens weren't just ornaments. They were active participants in the weird, exhausting game of medieval royalty. Palace rivalries. Inside any castle, rivalries simmered constantly. Courtiers, siblings, and even spouses were often locked in subtle, exhausting competitions. The French and English courts loved gossip, but also scheming. Someone's minor insult at dinner could trigger weeks of tension. If you offended the king, or worse, the queen, you might find yourself dismissed, exiled, or quietly ruined. Siblings were frequently rivals. Edward IV's brothers plotted against him, while his sisters' marriages were used as political pawns. In France, Louis XI treated his own family with suspicion, constantly manipulating or punishing relatives to maintain control. It wasn't personal, at least according to them, it was politics, which, for the royals, often meant cruelty disguised as necessity. Odd court rituals. Medieval courts loved ceremony, but sometimes these rituals were bizarrely specific or exhausting. In England, the coronation banquet included elaborate symbolic gestures. Dishes were placed in precise order, knights had to demonstrate loyalty in exact sequences, and even the placement of napkins mattered. Mistakes could be embarrassing or politically dangerous. Byzantine emperors staged elaborate receptions for foreign envoys. The protocol was so intricate that a single misstep in bowing or seating arrangements could imply insult or weakness. One misstep in bowing or seating arrangements could spark a diplomatic crisis, all without a single sword being drawn. The odd lives of royal children. As we've seen, child monarchs were common, but even non-ruling children were treated strangely. They had tutors, astrologers, and countless attendants. They were expected to learn languages, religion, swordsmanship, and etiquette simultaneously. Play was allowed only when it reinforced discipline or political education. And then there were the early marriages orchestrated for alliances. Children were dressed as miniature adults, paraded through courts, and expected to behave with the decorum of kings and queens. It's hard to imagine a 6-year-old sitting politely through a 4-hour banquet while calculating which allies were trustworthy. Petty jealousies and hidden schemes. Courts were rife with jealousy. Nobles coveted positions, spouses sought influence, and even servants sometimes plotted in whispers. A queen might favor one child, sparking resentment among siblings. Princes might compete for tutors' attention, hoping to gain an advantage in future succession. Every smile,
glance, and gesture carried meaning, and misinterpreting even a minor action could have long-lasting consequences. Royal rivalry was rarely violent. It was subtle, slow, and exhausting. And perhaps that's why history remembers so many of these conflicts as intrigues rather than outright wars. The daily grind of royal life. It's tempting to think of kings and queens as constantly feasting, hunting, or wearing glittering crowns. In reality, much of their days were mundane, exhausting, and repetitively ceremonial. Morning prayers, breakfast, audience with courtiers, administrative meetings, walks in the gardens. Then feasts, hunts, additional audiences, letters to other rulers, and more prayers. All under the constant surveillance of attendants, guards, and advisors. Even simple choices, what to wear, what to eat, when to walk in the gardens, were dictated by etiquette and politics. Life in a castle was a performance from dawn to dusk. Even sleep had to be carefully timed and supervised. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a queen consulting astrologers while the rest of the court waits, tense. Siblings sitting across a banquet hall, each calculating how to gain favor. A young prince practicing swordplay under the watchful eye of tutors and spies. Courtiers whispering secrets in shadowed corridors, while the king pretends to be unaware. Medieval royalty wasn't glamorous. It was a mix of tedious rituals, political games, eccentricity, and occasional terror. And yet, somehow, that makes it perfect for a quiet night of gentle reflection. Sleep now, drifting past tapestries, candlelight, and gilded halls. Let the whispering corridors, plotting queens, and tired kings accompany you into a calm, dream-filled night.
Part 9. Dynastic disasters, spoiled royal children, and palace absurdities. Welcome back, gentle listener. By now, you've wandered through corridors of velvet, golden crowns, and quietly tragic royal lives. Tonight, we float into dynastic disasters, spoiled children, and the subtle absurdities that made castles feel simultaneously majestic and ridiculous. Settle in, take a deep breath, and let the soft echo of history carry you. Dynastic disasters, when bloodlines backfired. Medieval monarchies were obsessed with keeping power in the family. Unfortunately, this often meant marrying close relatives. The Habsburgs, already mentioned, were masters of this. Multiple generations of cousin marriages created physical deformities and weakened heirs. Charles II of Spain, the half-baked Habsburg potato, was the tragic culmination of decades of inbreeding. He could barely speak or chew, and he left no heir. England wasn't immune. Henry VIII's 6 marriages weren't all about love. They were desperate attempts to secure a healthy male heir. And when genetics failed, political turmoil followed. Even minor royal families could experience dynastic nightmares. A single child's death or illness could throw entire kingdoms into succession crises. The pressure on every newborn was enormous. Your first cry might determine the future of a nation. Spoiled royal children, tiny tyrants. Royal children were often spoiled, as you might expect. They were treated as precious, fragile, and divinely chosen. But this sometimes backfired spectacularly. Henry III of France, for example, was reportedly overindulged by his parents. He grew up with few responsibilities, became timid and indecisive, and struggled to assert authority as king. Similarly, Edward VI of England was raised with immense care but constant pressure. Tutors imposed strict routines, diets, and lessons.
And yet, despite this intensive upbringing, the burden of ruling at a young age often overwhelmed them. Some royal children developed eccentricities as a result. Odd habits, fears, or obsessions were common. And since they were always under surveillance, any misstep could become political fodder. Palace absurdities, ceremonial and otherwise. Life in a medieval palace was filled with strange, often exhausting rituals. Daily routines were packed with prayers, audiences, meals, and walks. Dressing regulations were absurdly precise. Even the way a robe fell or a shoe was tied mattered politically. Dining could be elaborate theater. Certain dishes were served only on specific occasions, with attendants reciting their significance. The combination of ceremonial and mundane made palace life simultaneously luxurious and tedious. And then there were the personal oddities. Monarchs sometimes insisted on bizarre rituals, bathing at odd hours, often with perfumed oils, wearing specific colors for luck, carrying charms, amulets, or relics at all times. Even when nothing official was happening, these small habits filled the day with ritualistic structure. Tutors, advisors, and endless instruction. Royal children weren't left alone to grow up naturally. They had tutors for reading, writing, arithmetic, languages, theology, and etiquette. Astrologers might advise on favorable days, physicians on diet, and courtiers on alliances. This constant attention produced obedient, knowledgeable children, but also fragile, neurotic, and sometimes eccentric adults. Imagine being taught Latin at dawn, swordsmanship at noon, prayers at afternoon, and etiquette at dusk every single day. And yet mistakes were often fatal politically. A poorly chosen word in conversation or a misread document could trigger scandal or rebellion. Pets, playthings, and peculiar pastimes. In all this structured life, medieval royalty found small distractions. Pets were common: dogs, monkeys, peacocks, bears, and even more exotic animals. They were companions, entertainment, and symbols of wealth. But they could also be a nuisance. Monkeys stole food, dogs barked during ceremonies, and peacocks screamed at dawn. Royal children had toys, miniature horses, dolls, and puzzles. But even play was often structured, serving as training for leadership or etiquette. Free, unstructured childhoods were almost unheard of in royal life. Rivalries and subtle political maneuvers. Palaces were hives of competition. Siblings competed for attention, favor, and inheritance. Courtiers schemed for promotions and influence. Queens and consorts navigated delicate politics to secure their children's futures. This meant that every conversation, gesture, and smile carried weight. A child might be praised one day and punished the next, depending on shifting alliances. It was exhausting and often unfair. The weight of ceremonial life. Every day was a performance. Kings and queens had to appear majestic at all times, even while sick, tired, or frustrated. Ceremonies were meticulously choreographed. Even minor mistakes could lead to scandal. Crowns were heavy, robes were elaborate, and every movement had meaning. Meals were structured events, not just for nutrition. Public appearances were carefully staged to impress subjects and visiting dignitaries. Life in a palace was simultaneously grand and burdensome. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a young prince sitting stiffly in a hall listening to lessons while his peers whisper about toys. A queen consulting astrologers before breakfast, her mind already planning alliances. Courtiers moving silently through corridors, each plotting subtle advantages. Exotic pets wandering freely, adding chaos to perfectly choreographed routines. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. But in that quiet strangeness, there is a soft, hypnotic rhythm, a lullaby of velvet robes, flickering candles, and whispered intrigues. Sleep now. Let the echoes of palace halls, child monarchs, and eccentric queens drift gently with you. Because medieval royalty, in all its weirdness, is perfect company for a calm, reflective night.
Part 10. Tragic quirks, unusual diets, and royal death traditions. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you've wandered through hundreds of years of velvet robes, heavy crowns, and strangely tragic lives. Tonight we focus on personal quirks, diets that were bizarre by modern standards, and the slow, elaborate rituals surrounding royal death. So dim the lights, get cozy, and let the quiet absurdity of medieval monarchy lull you further. Tragic personal quirks. Many medieval monarchs had habits or obsessions that today might seem charming or deeply unsettling. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. He would wrap himself in blankets, avoid movement, and sometimes refuse to be touched. Imagine living under the same roof as someone who thinks they might shatter at any moment. Henry VI of England drifted in and out of catatonia, leaving advisors to manage a kingdom in his place. His quietness was terrifying for courtiers who never knew when he would regain focus, or if he ever would. Other quirks were less extreme, but still notable. Louis XIV spent hours attending to wigs, clothing, and posture, turning personal grooming into an almost religious ritual. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers constantly, planning even minor decisions according to the stars. These habits shaped their reigns and sometimes frustrated everyone around them. Unusual royal diets. Medieval royal diets could be indulgent, strange, or outright harmful. Henry VIII of England loved meat and sweets. His diet contributed to gout and obesity, making movement difficult in his later years. Meanwhile, Charles VI of France feasted on rich meat dishes that worsened his digestive problems. In Byzantium, emperors consumed large quantities of sugar, honey, and wine, often combining ingredients in ways that modern palates might find overwhelming. The caliphs of Cordoba, with their vast wealth, could enjoy rare spices, imported foods, and elaborate banquets daily. Royal diets were more than nutrition. They were displays of wealth, sophistication, and divine favor. But for many monarchs, they were quietly destructive, sapping energy and shortening lifespans. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royalty continued to perform. Royal funerals were long, elaborate affairs. Bodies were washed, clothed in fine garments, and laid out for public viewing. Some monarchs were embalmed, treated with resins and perfumes to preserve them for weeks. One Byzantine emperor was interred in a golden sarcophagus, while relatives argued over his crown. In France, tombs were decorated with angels, saints, and sculpted likenesses. Death was ceremonial, public, and even theatrical, a final display of power and prestige.
The smell of preservation, incense, and perfumed oils mingled with the flickering light of candles. Funerals were exhausting, elaborate, and often a political statement as much as a spiritual one. Royal superstitions. Superstition colored nearly every aspect of royal life. Kings consulted astrologers for everything, from battles to meals. Certain days were considered unlucky for travel, feasts, or even wearing particular colors. Charms, relics, and amulets were carried at all times to ward off misfortune. Charles IX of France, after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, relied on charms and astrologers to navigate daily life. Henry III of France consulted relics before making decisions. In other words, monarchs balanced power with deep, consistent anxiety over unseen forces. Child monarchs and the burden of rule. We've seen this theme before, but it's worth revisiting. Many monarchs ascended the throne as children. Edward VI of England, Henry VI, James II of Scotland. They were all forced to rule before fully understanding the world around them. Regents and advisors often guided these young rulers, but regents were not always benevolent. Power struggles, rivalries, and hidden agendas complicated every decision. A child might be trained for leadership, but their actual ability to rule was limited by circumstance and politics. Even small missteps could lead to rebellion or exile. Growing up royal was a mixture of education, intimidation, and relentless observation. The weight of ceremonial life. Royal life was full of rigid routines, elaborate attire, and constant observation. Crowns and robes were heavy, sometimes literally exhausting. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties filled every hour. Even leisure was structured. Hunting, music, or games were often political performances. Monarchs were rarely allowed private moments. Every smile, frown, and gesture carried meaning for courtiers and subjects alike. It was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. The absurdity of power. Despite all the rituals, ceremonies, and displays of divine authority, medieval monarchy was often fragile. Kings fell ill, heirs died young, marriages failed, and advisors schemed constantly. Power could vanish as quickly as it arrived. The grandeur of crowns, ceremonies, and palaces was a thin veneer over a world filled with anxiety, eccentricity, and quiet desperation. Yet, somehow, this fragility makes the lives of medieval monarchs mesmerizing. The strange habits, odd obsessions, and tragic quirks all form a hypnotic rhythm. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a monarch consulting horoscopes in the candlelight before breakfast, a young king practicing etiquette while secretly wishing to play outside, a queen obsessively arranging charms and relics to protect her family, a palace filled with exotic animals, servants, and whispering courtiers. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and often tragic, but there is a gentle, hypnotic rhythm to it. It's a soft, endless lullaby of velvet robes, crowns, and candlelight. Sleep now. Let the flickering shadows of courts, the whisper of tapestries, and the faint rustle of robes carry you into a
Part 11. Child monarchs, palace etiquette, and royal scandals. Welcome back, quiet night traveler. By now, you've wandered through the corridors of castles, peeked into the bedrooms of child monarchs, and felt the weight of velvet robes and heavy crowns. Tonight, we linger on the tiny tragedies, peculiar routines, and whispered scandals that made palace life quietly absurd. So dim the lights further, take a slow breath, and let's float into the muted drama of medieval royalty. Child monarchs, too young to rule, forced to reign. As we've seen, medieval monarchies often crowned children. Edward V of England was 12 when he became king. He spent his brief reign under the watchful eyes of advisors who, naturally, had their own agendas. 2 months later, he vanished into history as one of the infamous princes in the Tower. We can't know exactly what happened, but the story reminds us how dangerous it was to be young and royal. James II of Scotland ascended the throne as a child. He spent years under regents and constant supervision, learning to navigate palace politics before he could fully understand them. Child rulers had their days filled with lessons, etiquette, prayers, and observation. Play was rare, spontaneous fun rarer still. They were simultaneously idolized, scrutinized, and manipulated. Palace etiquette. Endless and absurd. Life in a castle required an almost impossible adherence to etiquette. When to bow, when to curtsy, and even how to hold a goblet mattered. Clothing was symbolic. Colors, embroidery, and jewelry all conveyed rank or allegiance. Dining was an elaborate performance. Who sat where, how they held their knife, and how many courses were served, all loaded with political meaning. Even walking down a hall required attention. Courtiers were always watching, judging, and reporting. One misstep could shift favor, provoke jealousy, or spark whispered scandal. Imagine moving through life where every gesture has consequences and you're 12 years old. It's exhausting, absurd, and slightly terrifying. Royal tutors. Strict, exhausting, and often cruel. Education for young monarchs was relentless. Tutors taught Latin, Greek, theology, swordsmanship, etiquette, and languages. Astrologers advised when to eat, when to pray, and when to make political decisions. Physicians dictated diets, sometimes bizarrely restrictive or indulgent. Many monarchs developed
peculiar habits from the pressures of palace life. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. Henry VI of England drifted in and out of catatonia. Louis XIV of France obsessed over wigs, posture, and the perfect appearance. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers for every decision, large or small. Monarchs lived under constant pressure to perform perfectly, and their quirks often reflected the stress of endless observation. Even small rituals, how to hold a cup, when to kneel, which colors to wear, could dominate daily life. These quirks were sometimes practical, sometimes symbolic, and sometimes just quietly strange. Royal diets, overindulgence, and oddities. Royal diets often reflected wealth, status, and superstition more than nutrition. Henry VIII of England ate vast amounts of meat and sweets, developing gout and obesity. Charles VI of France enjoyed rich feasts that worsened his digestive problems. Byzantine emperors consumed sugar, honey, and wine in combinations modern palates would find excessive. Diets were also symbolic. Eating exotic foods or rare spices reinforced status and divine favor. But the indulgence often contributed to chronic illness, fatigue, or early death. Death, funerals, and ceremonial obligation. Even death became performative for royalty. Bodies were washed, dressed, and laid out in elaborate ceremonies. Funerals could last days or weeks, with processions, prayers, and masses. Embalming sometimes preserved the body for weeks. One Byzantine emperor was placed in a golden sarcophagus while relatives argued over his crown. French tombs often featured angels, saints, and intricate sculptures. Death was ceremonial, public, and carefully choreographed. Soft reflections. So, tonight, imagine a young king, 12 years old, struggling to follow every rule while adults maneuver politically around him. A queen consulting astrologers in the candlelight while courtiers wait impatiently. Courtiers whispering secrets in shadowed corridors, subtle threats hidden beneath polite bows. A feast where every movement, glance, and gesture carries weight, and even the tiniest misstep might have consequences. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the quiet, hypnotic rhythm of robes, candles, and whispered intrigue is strangely mesmerizing. Sleep now. Let the flickering shadows of palace corridors, the faint rustle of velvet, and the murmuring courtiers drift with you into a calm, reflective night.
Part 12. Dynastic disasters, eccentric habits, and quiet tragedies. Welcome back, night traveler.
By now you've wandered through hundreds of years of velvet, crowns, and softly tragic royal lives. Tonight, we float into dynastic disasters, peculiar routines, and the small, quiet tragedies that colored everyday palace life. So dim the lights, settle deeper into your blanket, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you. Dynastic disasters, bloodlines gone awry. Royal families loved to marry within their own circles. Unfortunately, this often produced disastrous results. The Habsburgs, already infamous for their inbreeding, exemplify this best. Charles II of Spain, often described as the half-baked Habsburg potato, suffered severe physical and mental disabilities. He could barely speak, chew, or walk properly, and he left no heir. Other dynasties had their own problems. In France, multiple generations of closely related marriages produced fragile heirs who often died young. England wasn't immune either. Henry VIII's desperate search for a healthy male heir led to 6 marriages, 2 executions, and 1 broken kingdom. The lesson seems simple. Royal ambition often ignored basic biology. Eccentric habits, quirks of power. Many monarchs developed peculiar routines or obsessions. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. Henry VI of England drifted in and out of catatonia. Louis XIV of France spent hours tending wigs, clothing, and posture, turning grooming into ritual. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers for as much as small decisions. Odd habits weren't always harmless. They shaped policy, influenced decisions, and sometimes exacerbated political instability. The line between eccentricity and pathology was often blurred. Child monarchs, tiny figures on large thrones. Child rulers faced overwhelming pressure. Edward V of England was crowned at 12, spending his brief reign under the supervision of ambitious advisors. James II of Scotland became king as a child, navigating regions, nobles, and rival factions long before fully understanding power. Tutors and astrologers dominated their schedules, leaving little time for play. Even minor mistakes, forgetting a bow, missing a prayer, or mispronouncing Latin, could have serious consequences. Child monarchs were fragile, easily manipulated, and often tragically overburdened. Royal diets, luxury with consequences. Medieval royal diets were excessive and strange. Henry VIII's love of meat and sweets caused obesity and gout. Charles VI of France indulged in rich feasts that worsened his digestive issues. Byzantine emperors consumed sugar, honey, and wine in combinations that modern diets would consider dangerous. Meals were not merely sustenance, they were statements of power. Spices, exotic foods, and elaborate dishes symbolized wealth, influence, and divine favor. Yet these luxuries quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and sometimes early death. Palace life, ceremony, ritual, and endless observation. Life in a castle required constant performance. Crowns and robes were heavy, restrictive, and symbolic. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties filled every hour. Leisure was structured. Hunting, music, and games were often political performances. Even simple acts, walking, eating, or greeting a visitor, carried weight. Courtiers, advisors, and family members observed constantly, calculating advantage and plotting influence. Life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, subtle danger. Palaces thrived on secrecy. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings jockeyed for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect their children. Every glance, smile, and gesture could be interpreted as alliance or threat. Minor social missteps might spark scandal, affect succession, or trigger subtle revenge. The danger was quiet, subtle, and persistent. Even when no one was openly rebelling, the tension filled corridors and bedrooms alike. Tragic quirks and soft humor. Even in their tragedies, monarchs offered quiet, unintentional humor. Charles VI's glass delusion, though sad, presents a striking image of human vulnerability. Louis XIV's obsession with posture and wigs is both amusing and exhausting to imagine. Royal children forced into rigid schedules while secretly longing for play create a quiet tension that history preserves like a soft lullaby. These quirks were human, even in the grandeur of palace life. They remind us that royalty, for all its wealth and ceremony, was still fragile, awkward, and sometimes ridiculous. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royalty continued to perform. Funerals were elaborate, public, and carefully choreographed. Bodies were washed, dressed in fine garments, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some monarchs for weeks, creating a strange mix of reverence and theatricality. Byzantine emperors might be buried in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs often had tombs adorned with angels, saints, and sculptures. Death was ceremonial, ritualized, and infused with political meaning. Soft reflections. So, tonight, imagine a child king practicing etiquette while secretly longing to play outside. A queen consulting astrologers in the flickering candlelight. Courtiers whispering secrets along corridors, quietly calculating advantage. A feast where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet, in its quiet rhythm, robes rustling, candles flickering, whispering halls, there is a hypnotic, soft energy. Sleep now. Let the muted echoes of palace corridors, the gentle rustle of velvet, and the quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams. Part 13. Palace Absurdities, Spoiled Children, and Eccentric Monarchs. Welcome back, gentle night traveler. By now you've floated through corridors lined with tapestries, heard the whisper of courtiers, and glimpsed the quiet tragedies of royal lives. Tonight, we drift further into palace absurdities, spoiled children, and the eccentric habits that made medieval royalty strangely human. So dim the lights, settle deeper, and let the rhythm of softly tragic history guide you. Palace absurdities, ceremony overload. Life in a castle demanded endless attention to ceremony. Courtiers had to know exactly when to bow, curtsy, or sit. Clothing, jewelry, and even the way a robe draped were laden with symbolic meaning. Dining was a spectacle. Who ate first, how dishes were presented, and how many courses were served, all politically significant. One minor mistake, a misplaced gesture, a delayed bow, could ripple into weeks of subtle tension or gossip. Life in a palace was less about comfort and more about performing perfection at all times. Spoiled royal children, tiny tyrants. Royal children were often overindulged, yet simultaneously overburdened. Edward VI of England, raised under strict tutors, rarely had time for unstructured play. Yet, as the focus of intense attention, he grew accustomed to deference.
Young princes and princesses often became spoiled, demanding attention, temperamental or eccentric. Some, like Henry III of France, were pampered yet timid, struggling to assert themselves later as rulers. Others, like Margaret of Anjou, grew strong, cunning, and politically active, perhaps as a reaction to early pressures. Childhood in a palace was a mix of luxury, stress, and intense observation, and sometimes the results were quietly disastrous. Eccentric monarchs, quirks of power. Monarchs often developed peculiar habits under the pressures of court life. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass, moving carefully to avoid breaking. Henry VI of England drifted into catatonia at inconvenient moments. Louis XIV's obsession with wigs, posture, and attire consumed hours daily. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers and omens for almost every decision. These eccentricities weren't just quirks. They shaped policy, influenced court behavior, and occasionally destabilized entire kingdoms. In retrospect, they add both humor and melancholy to their stories. Royal diets. Luxury meets oddity. Food was both indulgence and performance. Henry VIII ate vast amounts of meat and sweets, contributing to obesity and gout. Charles VI's rich feasts worsened chronic digestive issues. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in ways modern palates would find overwhelming. Dining was a political statement. Exotic foods and spices displayed wealth, power, and divine favor. But excess often led to illness, fatigue, or early death. Court intrigue, whispered danger. Palaces were buzzing with quiet intrigue. Courtiers competed for favors. Siblings jockeyed for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect their children. Even minor gestures, smiles, glances, delayed bows carried meaning. Missteps could spark rumors, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Life was never peaceful. Danger was soft, pervasive, and constant, a whisper along corridors rather than a shout on battlefields. Tragic quirks and human oddities. Even in tragedy there was humor and pathos. Charles VI tiptoeing around, afraid to shatter. Louis XIV's obsession with posture and perfection. Children raised in strict routines while longing for simple play. These images are quietly funny, deeply human, and oddly comforting. They remind us that royalty, despite grandeur and ceremony, faced universal pressures, fears, and vulnerabilities. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were dressed in finery, displayed, and sometimes embalmed for weeks. Funerals were elaborate, public, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors were sometimes laid in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs were surrounded by angels, saints, and intricate sculptures. Death reinforced the idea of continuity, divine favor, and prestige. Even in passing, royalty maintained their ceremonial performance. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a child king learning etiquette while secretly wishing to escape into the gardens. A queen consulting astrologers by candlelight. Courtiers whispering secrets and calculating alliances. A banquet where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the quiet rhythm of robes, candles, whispering corridors, and eccentric habits forms a hypnotic lullaby. Sleep now,
Let the muted echoes of palace halls, the faint rustle of velvet, and the gentle absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 14. Dynastic disasters, eccentric routines, and quiet palace tragedies. Welcome back, gentle night traveler. By now you've wandered through corridors of velvet, glimpsed the curious habits of monarchs, and floated past whispering courtiers. Tonight we drift into dynastic disasters, unusual routines, and the soft tragedies that colored life in medieval castles. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let history's quiet rhythm lull you further. Dynastic disasters, when bloodlines betrayed. Royal families were obsessed with marrying within their circles. Unfortunately, this often produced physical and mental fragility. The Habsburgs were the masters of inbreeding. Charles II of Spain, the half-baked Habsburg potato, suffered from severe disabilities and left no heir. France, England, and other kingdoms also experienced fragile heirs, infant mortality, and succession crises. Royal ambition often ignored basic biology with catastrophic personal consequences. Crowns and kingdoms mattered more than healthy heirs. Eccentric routines, quirks of power. Monarchs developed peculiar habits under pressure. Charles VI believed he was made of glass. Henry VI drifted in and out of catatonia. Louis XIV obsessed over wigs, posture, and clothing. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers for minor decisions. These quirks shaped politics, destabilized courts, and influenced decisions. Sometimes funny in hindsight, sometimes tragic in effect, they reveal the human side of rulers expected to perform endlessly. Child monarchs, tiny rulers, huge responsibilities. Many monarchs ascended as children. Edward V of England was 12 when crowned. James II of Scotland assumed kingship in early childhood. They navigated regents, ambitious advisors, and jealous siblings long before understanding the world. Tutors dictated their days: Latin, Greek, swordsmanship, etiquette, prayers, and observation. Play was rare. Mistakes, forgetting a bow or mispronouncing a word, had real consequences. Child monarchs were fragile, observed constantly, and often tragically overburdened. Royal diets, excess, symbolism, and oddity. Food reflected status and superstition more than nutrition. Henry VIII's indulgence in meat and sweets caused obesity and gout. Charles VI, rich feasts worsened digestive issues. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in overwhelming ways. Dishes symbolized wealth and divine favor. Exotic foods were status markers, but overindulgence often led to illness and fatigue. Palace life, performance, observation, and subtle pressure. Palaces demanded constant performance. Crowns were heavy, robes elaborate. Daily prayers, audiences, and duties filled every hour. Leisure, hunting, music, and games were structured and political. Even minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried meaning. Courtiers observed constantly, calculating advantage and influence. Life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, quiet danger. Courts thrived on secrecy.
Courtiers competed for favor, siblings for attention, queens for protection. Every smile, glance, and gesture carried meaning. Missteps could spark rumor, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Danger was quiet, pervasive, and subtle, a whisper along corridors rather than a sword in hand. Tragic quirks, humanity in grandiosity. Even tragic habits had humor and humanity. Charles VI tiptoeing to avoid shattering. Louis XIV obsessively adjusting wigs and posture. Children forced into strict routines while longing for simple play. These glimpses remind us that monarchy, for all its grandeur, was human, fragile, and sometimes quietly ridiculous. Death and funerary rituals, performance until the end. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, displayed for days. Embalming sometimes preserved them for weeks. Funerals were public, elaborate, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors were placed in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs were surrounded by sculpted angels and saints. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and prestige. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a child king practicing etiquette while secretly wishing to escape into gardens. A queen consulting astrologers in flickering candlelight. Courtiers whispering secrets and plotting subtle advantage. A banquet where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the rhythm of robes, candles, whispering halls, and eccentric habits forms a hypnotic lullaby. Sleep now. Let muted echoes of palace corridors, the rustle of velvet, and quiet absurdities drift you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 15. More dynastic disasters, spoiled children, and peculiar habits that made medieval monarchs both human and absurd. Welcome back, quiet night traveler. By now, you've wandered through centuries of velvet robes, flickering candlelight, whispering courtiers, and the soft tragedies of royalty. Tonight we linger on dynastic disasters, spoiled children, and the peculiar habits that made medieval monarchs both human and absurd. So dim the lights further, settle in, and let the gentle rhythm of history carry you into a calm night. Dynastic disasters, bloodlines, and bad luck. Royal families had a habit of marrying within their circles. Unfortunately, this often produced fragile heirs and tragic results. The Habsburgs are infamous. Multiple generations of cousin marriages created Charles II of Spain, often called the half-baked Habsburg potato. He struggled to speak, chew, or walk, and left no heir. England faced similar problems. Henry VIII's obsession with securing a male heir led to 6 marriages, 2 executions, and widespread political turmoil. Even minor families experienced tragedies when children died young or marriages failed. Dynasties often prioritized power over health, leaving families and kingdoms precariously balanced. Spoiled children, tiny rulers, big expectations. Royal children were pampered, yet overburdened. Edward VI of England had tutors dictating every hour, leaving little room for unstructured play. Yet his royal status meant constant attention and deference. Some became spoiled, temperamental, or eccentric, while others, like Margaret of Anjou, grew politically savvy and cunning.
Childhood in a palace was a mix of luxury, stress, and constant observation, and the results were often quietly disastrous for their personalities and futures. Peculiar habits, quirks of monarchs. Many monarchs developed strange routines under palace pressures. Charles VI tiptoed, afraid he might shatter. Henry VI drifted in and out of catatonia. Louis XIV obsessed over wigs, posture, and clothing. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers for nearly every decision. These quirks were more than eccentric. They shaped politics, influenced court behavior, and occasionally destabilized kingdoms. They are a reminder that even absolute power comes with human vulnerability. Royal diets, excess and oddity. Food reflected wealth, superstition, and status more than nutrition. Henry VIII ate vast quantities of meat and sweets, developing gout and obesity. Charles VI feasted on rich foods that worsened health problems. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in combinations modern palates would find overwhelming. Dining was symbolic. Exotic foods demonstrated wealth, influence, and divine favor. Yet overindulgence quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and early death. Palace life, ritual, observation, and soft pressure. Palaces demanded constant performance. Crowns were heavy, robes elaborate. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties filled every hour. Leisure, hunting, music, games was structured and often political. Even minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried weight. Courtiers observed constantly, calculating advantage and influence. Life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, subtle danger. Courts thrived on secrecy. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings jockeyed for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect their children. Even small gestures, smiles, glances, or delayed bows could spark rumors, jealousy, or quiet revenge. Danger was subtle, pervasive, and constant. Tragic quirks and human oddities. Even in tragedy, there was quiet humor and humanity. Charles VI's glass delusion, though sad, paints a striking image. Louis XIV's obsession with posture in wigs is both amusing and exhausting to imagine. Children raised in rigid routines while longing for simple play provide a soft, human contrast to grandiose ceremonies. These glimpses remind us that royalty, despite wealth and power, was fragile, awkward, and deeply human. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some for weeks. Funerals were public, elaborate, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors were sometimes placed in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs surrounded themselves with angels, saints, and intricate sculptures. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and ceremonial prestige. Soft reflections. So tonight imagine a child king practicing etiquette while secretly longing for play. A queen consulting astrologers by candlelight. Courtiers whispering in shadowed corridors, subtly plotting advantage. A banquet where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the quiet rhythm of robes rustling, candles flickering, and quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams. Sleep now. Let the muted echoes of palace corridors, the faint rustle of velvet, and quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 16. More eccentricities, palace tragedies, and dynastic quirks. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you've wandered through halls of velvet, peeked into child monarchs' bedrooms, and witnessed the quiet tragedies of royal life. Tonight, we drift further into the peculiar habits, small disasters, and subtle absurdities that filled medieval palaces. Dim the lights, settle deeper, and let the rhythm of softly tragic history carry you. Dynastic quirks, bloodlines, and bad luck. Royal families loved marrying within their circles. Unfortunately, repeated cousin marriages often produced fragile heirs. The Habsburgs exemplified this. Charles II of Spain, the half-baked Habsburg potato, suffered severe disabilities and left no heir. France and England faced similar issues, with infant mortality and succession crises common. Ambition often outweighed common sense. Crowns mattered more than healthy heirs, and dynastic planning sometimes created quiet tragedies. Eccentric monarchs. Quirks of power. Monarchs frequently developed odd routines. Charles VI tiptoed to avoid breaking, believing he was made of glass. Henry VI drifted in and out of catatonia, leaving advisors to manage the kingdom. Louis XIV obsessed over wigs, clothing, and posture. Catherine de' Medici relied heavily on astrologers for even minor decisions. These eccentricities shaped political decisions, court behavior, and sometimes destabilized kingdoms. There are reminders that absolute power does not eliminate human vulnerability. Child monarchs. Tiny figures on large thrones. Children often ascended to the throne. Edward V of England was crowned at 12. James II of Scotland became king in early childhood. Tutors, astrologers, and regents dictated their days. Play was rare. Every mistake, forgetting a bow, mispronouncing a word, carried potential consequences. Child monarchs were observed constantly, overburdened, and often tragically fragile. Royal diets. Luxury and oddity. Medieval royal diets were excessive and sometimes harmful. Henry VIII ate vast amounts of meat and sweets, leading to gout and obesity. Charles VI feasted on rich foods that worsened health problems. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in unusual ways. Meals symbolized status and divine favor. Exotic foods displayed wealth, but overindulgence quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and early death. Palace life. Ritual, observation, and endless performance. Life in a castle required constant performance. Crowns were heavy, robes elaborate. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties filled every hour. Even leisure, hunting, music, games, was structured and political. Minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried significance. Courtiers observed constantly, calculating advantage and influence. Palace life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals. Quiet danger. Courts thrived on secrecy. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings jockeyed for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect their children. Even small gestures, smiles, glances, or delayed bows could spark rumors, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Danger was quiet, pervasive, and constant, a whisper along corridors rather than a sword in hand. Tragic quirks. Humanity in grandiosity. Even in tragedy, there is humor and humanity. Charles VI tiptoeing to avoid shattering. Louis XIV adjusting wigs and posture for hours. Children longing for play while forced into rigid routines.
These glimpses remind us that royalty, despite wealth and ceremony, was fragile, awkward, and deeply human. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some for weeks. Funerals were public, elaborate, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors were placed in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs surrounded themselves with angels, saints, and sculptures. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and ceremonial prestige. Soft reflections. So, tonight, imagine a child king learning etiquette while secretly wishing to play outside. A queen consulting astrologers by candlelight. Courtiers whispering in corridors, subtly plotting advantage. A feast where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the rhythm of robes rustling, candles flickering, and whispering halls forms a gentle, hypnotic lullaby. Sleep now. Let the muted echoes of palace corridors, the faint rustle of velvet, and quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 17. Spoiled princes, eccentric queens, and dynastic oddities. Welcome back, quiet night traveler. By now you've drifted through centuries of velvet, candlelight, and softly tragic royal lives. Tonight, we explore spoiled princes, eccentric queens, and the subtle, often absurd dynamics of dynastic life. So dim the lights further, settle in, and let history's gentle rhythm carry you. Spoiled princes, tiny tyrants. Royal children were often pampered yet heavily constrained. Edward VI of England had tutors controlling every moment of his day. Play was rare, but attention and deference were constant. Many young princes grew spoiled, demanding, or temperamental, little monarchs learning early that their whims could reshape palace life. Others, like Margaret of Anjou, grew politically aware and cunning, a product of both pressure and observation. Childhood in a palace was a mix of luxury, stress, and constant scrutiny. The combination sometimes led to quiet disasters in adulthood. Eccentric queens, power, superstition, and habits. Queens often displayed quirks that shaped politics. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers obsessively, planning court life and major decisions around horoscopes. Isabella of Castile, a devout monarch, reportedly slept little and obsessed over prayer schedules. Eleanor of Aquitaine was politically active yet famously unconventional in her habits and influence. These eccentricities were rarely harmless. They could shape policy, provoke rivalries, or create subtle court tensions. Yet they also reveal how human even the most powerful women of the era could be. Dynastic oddities, bloodlines, and genetics. Royal families frequently married within their own circles. This practice often produced fragile heirs, physical deformities, and early deaths. The Habsburg jaw is perhaps the most famous example. Charles II of Spain suffered extreme disabilities from generations of cousin marriages. France, England, and Spain all experienced heirs who were sickly, short-lived, or mentally fragile. Ambition often outweighed biological sense. Dynastic planning produced fragile bodies and sometimes fragile kingdoms. Peculiar monarch habits,
Daily eccentricities. Many monarchs developed strange daily routines. Charles VI tiptoed around to avoid breaking. Henry VI drifted into catatonia at inconvenient moments. Louis XIV spent hours obsessing over wigs, posture, and clothing. Queens like Catherine de' Medici relied on astrology and omens for even minor decisions. These habits influenced governance, court behavior, and sometimes even succession. In retrospect, they are both amusing and quietly tragic. Royal diets, extravagance, and odd combinations. Royal diets were extravagant, symbolic, and often unhealthy. Henry VIII's massive intake of meat and sweets led to gout and obesity. Charles VI feasted on rich foods that exacerbated health issues. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in ways modern palates would find excessive. Meals signaled wealth, power, and divine favor. Excess, however, quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and early mortality. Palace life, endless performance. Palace life demanded constant attention and performance. Crowns and robes were heavy and symbolic. Daily prayers, audiences, and duties filled each hour. Leisure, music, hunting, and games were structured and political. Even minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried meaning. Courtiers observed constantly, calculating advantage and influence. Palace life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, quiet danger. Courts thrived on secrecy. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings vied for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect their children. Small gestures, smiles, glances, or delayed bows could spark rumors, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Danger was subtle, pervasive, and constant. Tragic quirks, humor in fragility. Even in tragic habits contained quiet humor and humanity. Charles VI tiptoeing to avoid shattering. Louis XIV adjusting wigs and posture for hours. Children longing for play while trapped in rigid routines. These glimpses remind us that royalty, despite wealth and ceremony, was deeply human and fragile. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some for weeks. Funerals were public, elaborate, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors were sometimes placed in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs surrounded themselves with angels, saints, and sculptures. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and ceremonial prestige. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a spoiled young prince learning etiquette while longing for play. An eccentric queen consulting astrologers by candlelight. Courtiers whispering secrets in corridors, subtly plotting advantage. A royal feast where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the rhythm of rustling robes, flickering candles, and quiet absurdities forms a gentle, hypnotic lullaby. Sleep now. Let the muted echoes of palace corridors, the faint rustle of velvet, and quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 18. Palace Intrigue. Fragile Monarchs.
and subtle absurdities. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you've wandered through centuries of velvet, candlelight, whispering courtiers, and quietly tragic royal lives. Tonight, we drift further into palace intrigue, fragile monarchs, and the subtle absurdities that quietly shaped medieval courts. Dim the lights, settle into your blanket, and let the calm rhythm of history guide you. Fragile monarchs, childhood under pressure. Most medieval monarchs were crowned as children, inheriting enormous responsibilities far too early. Edward V of England became king at 12 under the strict supervision of regents and advisors. James II of Scotland similarly ascended as a child, navigating regency and political factions. Tutors dictated every hour: Latin, Greek, swordsmanship, religious instruction, and etiquette. Play was almost non-existent. Mistakes, like a forgotten bow or mispronounced word, could have serious consequences. Child monarchs were fragile, observed constantly, and often tragically overburdened. Dynastic disasters, bloodlines, and bad luck. Royal families frequently married within their own circles. This often produced sickly heirs, physical deformities, or early deaths. The Habsburgs are notorious. Charles II of Spain, the half-baked Habsburg potato, suffered extreme disabilities and left no heir. France, England, and Spain all faced fragile or mentally impaired heirs due to repeated cousin marriages. Ambition often outweighed biology, and dynastic planning sometimes led to quietly tragic consequences for both family and kingdom. Eccentric monarchs, odd habits, and daily quirks. Monarchs often developed strange routines under palace pressures. Charles VI tiptoed to avoid breaking. Henry VI drifted in and out of catatonia. Louis XIV obsessively adjusted wigs, clothing, and posture. Queens like Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers and omens constantly. These habits shaped court politics, decision-making, and succession. They remind us that even absolute power could not escape human frailty. Royal diets, extravagance, and consequences. Food symbolized status, divine favor, and power, but often harmed the eater. Henry VIII consumed excessive meat and sweets, leading to gout and obesity. Charles VI feasted on rich foods that worsened health problems. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in combinations modern palates would find strange or overwhelming. Exotic dishes showcased wealth, but overindulgence quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and early mortality. Palace life, ritual, observation, and performance. Palace life demanded constant vigilance and ceremonial attention. Crowns and robes were heavy and symbolic. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties filled every hour. Even leisure, hunting, music, or games was structured and often political. Minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried significance. Courtiers observed constantly, calculating advantage, influence, and gossip. Life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, subtle threats. Courts thrived on quiet intrigue. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings vied for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect children. Small gestures, smiles, glances, delayed bows, could spark rumors, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Danger was quiet, pervasive, and constant. A whisper along corridors rather than a sword in hand. Tragic quirks and soft humor. Even tragic habits contained gentle humor and humanity. Charles VI tiptoeing to avoid breaking. Louis XIV adjusting wigs and posture endlessly. Children longing for play while trapped in rigid routines. These glimpses reveal that royalty, despite grandeur and ceremony, was fragile, awkward, and human. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some for weeks. Funerals were public, elaborate, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors were sometimes placed in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs surrounded themselves with angels, saints, and sculptures. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and ceremonial prestige. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a fragile child king practicing etiquette while longing to run outside. An eccentric queen consulting astrologers in dim candlelight. Courtiers whispering along corridors, subtly plotting advantage. A royal feast where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the rhythm of rustling robes, flickering candles, and quiet absurdities forms a gentle, hypnotic lullaby. Sleep now. Let the muted echoes of palace corridors, the faint rustle of velvet, and quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 19. Palace tragedies, eccentric routines, and quiet dynastic crises. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you've wandered through centuries of flickering candlelight, whispering courtiers, velvet robes, and the quiet tragedies of royal lives. Tonight, we drift further into palace tragedies, eccentric routines, and the subtle crises quietly shaping dynasties. Dim the lights, settle deeper, and let the calm, hypnotic rhythm of history carry you. Palace tragedies, small crises, big impact. Royal families often faced minor disasters with outsized consequences. A child monarch missing a lesson could be criticized by tutors and regents. A misplaced gesture could upset a courtier, igniting weeks of subtle tension. A spoiled prince throwing a tantrum might disrupt political negotiations. Even without war or invasion, life inside a palace was fraught with small, persistent stressors. Tragedy here was quiet, disappointment, manipulation, subtle isolation, not dramatic explosions. Eccentric routines, the strange daily lives of monarchs. Monarchs often adopted peculiar routines that shaped palace life. Charles VI tiptoed carefully to avoid breaking. Henry VI drifted into catatonia at inconvenient moments. Louis XIV obsessed over wigs, posture, and attire for hours. Queens, like Catherine de' Medici, relied on astrology for nearly all decisions. Odd habits affected policy, court hierarchy, and succession. They remind us that power does not eliminate human fragility. Child monarchs, tiny figures on large thrones. Many monarchs inherited their crowns as children. Edward V of England was crowned at 12. James II of Scotland became king in early childhood. Tutors, regents, and advisors dictated nearly every hour. Play was limited. Mistakes could carry consequences. Child monarchs were constantly observed, overburdened, and often quietly fragile. Dynastic crises, bloodlines, and fragility. Royal families frequently married within their own circles, producing fragile heirs and genetic complications. The Habsburgs' infamous jaw and physical disabilities, exemplified by Charles II of Spain, illustrate the risks of repeated cousin marriages. France, England, and Spain all experienced heirs weakened by generations of inbreeding. Ambition often outweighed biology, producing quietly tragic consequences for both family and kingdom. Royal diets, access and performance. Food symbolized wealth, divine favor, and power, but often harmed the eater. Henry VIII ate vast quantities of meat and sweets, developing obesity and gout. Charles VI's indulgences worsened digestive problems. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in combinations modern palates would find strange. Dining was symbolic. Exotic foods demonstrated wealth, influence, and divine favor. Excess quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and early death. Palace life, ceremony, observation, and performance. Life in a palace demanded constant attention and performance. Crowns and robes were heavy, symbolic, and restrictive. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties consumed every hour. Leisure, music, hunting, and games was structured and often political. Minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried meaning. Courtiers observed constantly, calculating advantage, influence, and gossip. Life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, quiet danger. Courts thrived on secrecy and subtle manipulation. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings vied for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect children. Small gestures, smiles, glances, delayed bows could spark rumors, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Danger was quiet, pervasive, and constant, a whisper along corridors rather than a sword in hand. Tragic quirks, humor in humanity. Even tragic habits contained gentle humor and humanity. Charles VI, tiptoeing to avoid shattering. Louis XIV, adjusting wigs and posture endlessly. Children longing for play while trapped in strict routines. These glimpses remind us that royalty, despite wealth and ceremony, was fragile, awkward, and deeply human. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royals performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some for weeks. Funerals were public, elaborate, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors sometimes rested in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs surrounded themselves with angels, saints, and elaborate sculptures. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and ceremonial prestige. Soft reflections. So tonight, imagine a fragile child king learning etiquette while longing to escape into gardens. An eccentric queen consulting astrologers in flickering candlelight. Courtiers whispering secrets along corridors, subtly plotting advantage.
a royal feast where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet the gentle rhythm of rustling robes, flickering candles, and quiet absurdities forms a hypnotic lullaby. Sleep now. Let the muted echoes of palace corridors, the soft rustle of velvet, and quiet absurdities drift with you into calm, reflective dreams.
Part 20. Final reflections on the weird, fragile, and peculiar life of royalty. Welcome back, night traveler. By now, you've wandered through centuries of velvet, flickering candlelight, whispering courtiers, spoiled children, and eccentric monarchs. Tonight, in this final part, we drift gently into reflections on the quiet absurdities, fragile dynasties, and the oddly human side of medieval royalty. Dim the lights fully, settle deeper, and let the soft rhythm of history guide you into the end of our journey. Dynastic fragility, lessons of bloodlines. Royal families were obsessed with marrying within their own circles. This often produced fragile heirs, early deaths, and subtle crises of succession. The Habsburgs' repeated cousin marriages created Charles II of Spain, a half-baked Habsburg potato suffering severe physical and mental disabilities. France, England, and Spain all faced children who were sickly or mentally impaired due to similar practices. Ambition frequently outweighed biology. Crowns mattered more than health, leaving families and kingdoms precariously balanced. Even centuries later, these quiet lessons echo: power cannot override nature. Child monarchs, tiny figures on massive thrones. Many medieval rulers ascended as children, learning responsibility far too soon. Edward V of England became king at 12 under the supervision of regents and tutors. James II of Scotland faced similar pressures. Tutors dictated every hour Latin, swordsmanship, prayer, and etiquette. Play was minimal. Mistakes could carry real consequences. Child monarchs were fragile, observed constantly, and often tragically overburdened. Eccentric monarchs, quirks of power. Monarchs often developed unusual routines that shaped palace life. Charles VI tiptoed around afraid of breaking. Henry VI drifted in and out of catatonia. Louis XIV obsessively adjusted wigs, clothing, and posture. Catherine de' Medici consulted astrologers for nearly every decision. These eccentricities influenced policy, court behavior, and succession. Even absolute power could not prevent human frailty. Royal diets, luxury, status, and consequence. Food was extravagant, symbolic, and sometimes dangerous. Henry VIII's vast consumption of meat and sweets caused gout and obesity. Charles VI feasted on rich foods, worsening health problems. Byzantine emperors combined sugar, honey, and wine in ways modern palates would find overwhelming. Meals were statements of wealth, divine favor, and status. Overindulgence quietly contributed to illness, fatigue, and early death. Palace life, ritual, and observation. Palaces demanded constant performance. Crowns were heavy, robes elaborate and symbolic. Daily prayers, audiences, and official duties filled every hour. Even leisure, music, hunting, or games was structured and political. Minor gestures, walking, eating, bowing, carried immense meaning.
Courtiers observed constantly, calculating influence, advantage, and gossip. Palace life was exhausting, absurd, and relentless. Whispered scandals, quiet danger. Courts thrived on subtle intrigue. Courtiers competed for favor. Siblings jockeyed for attention. Queens maneuvered to protect children. Small gestures, smiles, glances, or delayed bows could spark rumors, jealousy, or subtle revenge. Danger was quiet, pervasive, and constant, a whisper along corridors rather than a sword in hand. Tragic quirks, humanity in grandiosity. Even the most serious eccentricities contain gentle humor. Charles VI tiptoeing around to avoid shattering. Louis XIV endlessly adjusting wigs and posture. Children longing for play while trapped in strict routines. These glimpses remind us that royalty, despite wealth and ceremony, was fragile, eccentric, and quietly tragic. Death and funerary rituals. Even in death, royalty performed. Bodies were washed, dressed in finery, and displayed for days. Embalming preserved some for weeks. Funerals were elaborate, public, and ritualized. Byzantine emperors rested in golden sarcophagi. French monarchs surrounded themselves with angels, saints, and elaborate sculptures. Death reinforced continuity, divine favor, and ceremonial prestige. Even in passing, royalty maintained performance. Final reflections. So tonight, imagine a fragile child king learning etiquette while longing to escape into the gardens. An eccentric queen consulting astrologers in flickering candlelight. Courtiers whispering in shadowed corridors, subtly plotting advantage. A royal banquet where every bite, glance, and gesture carries hidden meaning. Royal life was exhausting, absurd, and fragile. Yet in its quiet rhythm, the rustle of velvet, flickering candles, and whispering halls, there is a hypnotic lullaby. Medieval royalty, for all its pomp, wealth, and ceremony, was deeply human, fragile, eccentric, and quietly tragic. They remind us that behind crowns and titles were real people, struggling with pressures, quirks, and the strange absurdities of life. Sleep now. Let the soft echoes of palace corridors, the faint rustle of robes, and the gentle absurdities of history carry you into calm, reflective dreams. Good night, night traveler. Your journey through the weird, fragile, and quietly tragic lives of medieval royalty concludes here.